Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode with the Energy Africa, a storytelling series that shapes the mindset and intellect and how we interact with the three trilemmas of energy system in Africa, which entails the energy equity, sustainability, and the impact it has on the environment. And what exactly does it look like for the future of the youngsters coming into the industry? My name is Esiabo Sele, and I am an energy engineer and consultant with a focus in energy storage resources, most especially in batteries. I'm your host today. I have with me one of the most brilliant and experienced personnel in the energy equity and sustainability sector in Africa, Sumaya Mohammed. How are you doing today, Sumaya?
Thank you so much, Iziabo. It's a pleasure to be with you in the audience today.
So currently acts as the Utility Innovation and Uganda's Country Director for Power for All, and she has spearheaded development and expansion of groundbreaking utilities models. And she also leads prominent initiatives, including the international acclaimed Utility 2.0 campaign, which won 2023 Ashton Award for Integrated Energy in Africa for Uganda. She is a highly qualified professional with a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a master's in sustainable energy development. Simaya was also honored as the Sub-Saharan Africa Regional Energy Manager in 2022. That is so much wealth you have, Sumaya. That is so brilliant.
Thank you so much for just sharing some of the accolades. So for me, it humbles me, but I still believe there's a lot that I need to do. And I believe you just need to show up every day. That's just, my motto is we need to give more than 100% every day. And let's see, what can we achieve every day. That's just, my outlook and my perspective in life. But thank you so much for, that introduction.
Yeah, you're welcome. Looking at your background and your educational journey from a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering and a master's in sustainable energy development with an MBA, can you tell us how the beginning was like for you and what strikes your passion in the sustainable energy industry?
Well, thank you so much for that question. First of all, I want to say that I I believe education it's a stepping stone, or education really allows us to show that we have the ability to learn. And I've always told myself that you shouldn't be defined by your degrees that you have held, because you are going to like learning is a constant process. I don't think anyone stops learning. Think just learning is just a constant, process that one has to embark on. But to answer the question and give people more context, I think when people hear that you study chemical engineering, and I think you can also resonate, with this, Isiabo, is people think that, you need to be stuck in a lab and, all of these chemical equations, but that is so far
Yeah.
from, what chemical engineering is. So automatically it was very challenging after receiving a chemical engineering degree to even just enter, the job market. And I always, challenged myself that I was not going to be defined or be, placed in a box. I was going to, find, what are my strengths and my capabilities so that, I could, hone, my skills. So already off from the bat during my university third year, that you have to do a 1 year internship in industry. And I was adamant to, only apply for, niche or unconventional sectors. And the first one that came up, there were two. It was Sands Fibers, and that was a company that was, manufacturing highly specialized nylon and polyester yarn for different market applications. And then the second opportunity came, which was Schlumberger. So that was the oil and gas sector. Now, my eyes were set on the oil and gas sector, and you would be like, that is so far from, what I'm doing today. But I do believe that if I hadn't, explored and also had the opportunity to work in the oil and gas sector, I would not be where I am today. First of all, I think even just the process of getting into the oil and gas sector, it was quite a journey. Very strenuous, interview process. I remember going through almost 7, 8 interviews, and then being only one of two females, being awarded the position. That was actually the first time that I also left the country. So you can imagine, here you are as a young person, you're female, and I was assigned to work offshore in Angola. There was a lot to unpack and digest. Angola, I knew very little at the time, but when I first landed, I immediately realized that, the comforts of South Africa, where I was born and raised, I quickly realized that there isn't infrastructure. But what really started hitting home for me was the journey just to reach the base camp, because I was based in a place called Cabinda. So Cabinda is like in the northern part of Angola, close to DRC. So you first take a flight, obviously. As I said, I was based in Cape Town. So from Cape Town, you go to Johannesburg. Johannesburg, you enter into Luanda. And then from Luanda, you've got to take a very small little aircraft, like 6, 7 people. So it's not, a commercial flight. The flight is very unstable. And then you land into Cabinda. And then even, immigration in Cabinda was quite scary because, again, they were still building the airport, but nonetheless, you go through, immigration in Cabinda, and then you've got to take a 2-hour bus drive into what was called the base camp, which was called Hotel Malongo. And that 2-hour journey, it gave me a lot of time to reflect. First of all, I barely understood what the oil and gas sector was, but I quickly realized that it is a very male dominated sector. It's very dirty, dirty in every single word. I mean, the amount of pollution, it just makes you question yourself as a young engineer during that 2-hour journey in terms of what are you doing with your life. And I had done this job for almost 6 months. If you understand the drilling process, if you're drilling oil, you normally hit pockets of gas. And the one thing that really used to anger me is they used to flare this gas. Now, bearing in mind that the base camp in which us as expats were being housed, we had all of the comforts. We had internet, we had running, clean drinking water that you could drink from the taps, we had tarmac roads, there was a lot of entertainment facilities. Life was good at the base camp. But as you drive towards that base camp, you are passing through very many villages. And in these villages, you can see that people, are in, their humble homes. But you can see there's no roads. You can hardly see, any infrastructure in the small towns that you're passing through. And it just kept on, irking me. Like, why are we flaring the gas? Why are we not, putting, a gas, turbine to allow these communities to have access to electricity. So as I said, these journeys, it really started, raising so many questions. And also, as I said, the environmental pollution, so much waste, gets generated, on a rig. You're in the middle of the ocean, and many a times, they just flush those things into the ocean. So there were all of these, questions that kept on just cropping up. And bearing in mind at the time, I'm only 23 years old. So I remember going on my last journey and I told myself, I cannot work in the sector. If I have come this far to obtain, just an undergraduate degree, this is not, what I'm going to dedicate my skills and my life towards. So I made an intentional decision after I completed, that 1 year working offshore to look into a career that had to do with the environment. Now, bearing also in mind that this was the early 2000s, I mean, courses like renewable energy and sustainable development, there weren't any, yet alone, in Africa. So I knew it had to be something with the environment, but I was going to be very intentional in terms of what my next job was going to be. So I came back, went and done my bachelor's in chemical engineering, and I got very lucky. A friend of mine at the time, she was working for the wastewater, department for the city of Cape Town. And she told me, why don't you consider applying for this job in waste management? And I was like, waste management. I knew very little about waste management, but the more I read and I saw there's actually quite a bit of, chemical engineering processes that gets applied into a landfill site. So I was like, okay, this looks interesting. I might, consider this. And that was really my first entry into, what I'm going to call the sustainability sector. I started off in waste management, and that opened up the world of what can you do with landfill gas? What do you do with that leachate? How can you, create other products out of waste to generate, energy? So that was really, my stepping stone and just my entry point from pivoting from an oil and gas sector to making an intentional, decision of I am not going to work again in the fossil fuel sector. So I'll pause there, but that was only the beginning of that journey. I mean, as you've clearly said, I had to go and study quite a bit. And luckily, a few years down the line, sustainable development courses started opening up. And that is just how I started further educating myself in this field.
This is now bringing me back to your current position at the Power for All, where you are leading strategic team in testing and scaling innovative utility models across Africa. You have done that in South Africa. Now you are doing an extremely important job in Uganda by bridging together decentralized renewable energy providers and traditional utility guys together in Uganda to ensure that the electricity access gap is reduced. And you're doing that through one innovative model that caught my attention, which is the Utility 2.0 integrated energy model. Can you share more light about what this model is all about?
Thank you so much for that question. I want to just first give, some context. I don't know how much of our listeners understands, what is happening in Uganda, but to just give some context. Right now, the grid is only servicing 19% of Uganda's population, while, 34%, of the rest of the country is, being powered up by either solar home systems or mini grids. And that just shows the power of renewable energy. I think the other key, to just give people further context is that Uganda is one of the few countries that has excellent laws. And I think that is, the other conundrum is that the country has very well policies in place, but yet if you look at how many people has access to power, very few has access to power. That normally just, is a conundrum because how can it be that you have good policies, yet implementation and what is happening on the ground is far from, where one should be. So Uganda is that unique case. At the same time, I also think it's important, to just kind of give further context to our listeners that if we think of utilities, not many of us really understands that the utility business model hasn't changed. I think for us, we don't recognize that we are living in a very unique and exciting era. And, to experience this transition, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And let me expand. So if you think of the utility model, utilities have been providing electricity to people by just taking the traditional poles and wires to homes and businesses for the last 100 years. And all of a sudden, you have solar energy and renewable energy coming into, the market in the last 10 years. And all of a sudden, the utility is like, whoa, what is happening? I'm not, the only entity that can provide power to people. And that is, causing utilities to also relook at how are they operating and what is happening, in terms of their business model. And I think for me, that is important to understand. I think the other key thing is if we also look at how, the governments are providing power to new unelectrified areas, again, as I said, they often invest in the utility, and with that, the utility will just take a pole and a wire and they'll make a connection. But if you look at the sustainability of that connection, it becomes problematic because one, that connection becomes very expensive. The people or the community that has been given power, they don't understand how to make money out of this power. So you find that these communities are using power mainly for lighting and, for charging phones, but not really using power productively. And this really becomes a huge challenge, not just, for the utility, but for us as the taxpayers, because at the end of the day, the grid is also highly subsidized. And this is really where, the utility in Uganda, they said we cannot continue just extending and giving power to people, but at the end of the day, the sustainability of the network, it's not there. Can we do things differently? How can we, stimulate these communities ahead of time so that by the time that the grid arrives, these customers, are grid ready or they are using power, more productively. So that was really, the challenge that was thrown at us. And I think to further, add context is if you think of a mini grid or productive use of energy players, they are not often working with utilities. Often people would say, aren't, aren't they the competitor to the utility? But that is in which, this innovation comes up, is why should we be seeing one another as adversaries? Can we not, see one another more as, complementary? And how can we work together? And that is ultimately what we've done in this project. So that is where the term Utilities 2.0 comes from. It's how do you take a traditional utility and how does that utility transform and also start to innovate and collaborate, with other stakeholders, in the sector. And that is, primarily just what we done is we said, can the utility work with a mini grid player and productive use partners? And how, would that collaboration look like? Again, under the premise of solving for this grid extension challenge in which, the utility was facing. So I think for me, I want to pause there because I think it's really important to understand that we need to, stop seeing one another as adversaries. And it's again, is there an opportunity to collaborate? What does that collaboration mean? And how, do we, translate that into implementation?
That is a very powerful statement, like to end this question, I would say. So this also brings us back to the Uganda as a community in a whole. With this tool, the Utility 2.0 integrated energy model, what market gap is this tool trying to solve in Uganda at the moment when compared to the previous
Yeah,
model that was already applied?
thank you so much for asking that question. And I think, again, this comes to the context. If we think about it, in sub-Saharan Africa alone, there's over 600 million people, that lacks access to electricity. And there's a recent study that was done, and they asked the question, how many people are living 1 hour from a town or a place that has got electricity? And this research was astounding. It showed that over 30% of people are living just 1 hour from where the grid stops. And that is really, to put things into perspective, is as much as, the governments through the energy plans, they try to demarcate areas where different technologies can play. The reality is that the grid cannot even, satisfy the demand within, a 5 to 10 kilometer radius where, they should be operating. So the reality is if we just leave, grid extension to, make the connections as per, what the energy planners would defined, which is the service territory of 5 to 10 kilometers from where the grid stops. The reality is 180 million people. That is 30% of, the 600 million plus people is going to remain without power. So that just means we're never going to achieve SDG, 7 by 2030. We're already out of time. And that is ultimately what we're trying to tackle is we cannot continue as business as usual.
That's that is when you just be like, okay, we dropped the mic at this point in time. But what would be like, how would they shift? How would it shift the way electrification business has been done traditionally, and what can we expect in the future with such tool coming into play in the African electricity space?
Okay. I think I want us to maybe just also share what we done because I think it's important for us to appreciate, how do these partners work together and what does this solve for? We've already painted the picture that, there is, 30%, of the 600, million people that is just 1 hour from where the grid has stopped. So we also know that governments are constrained. So the amount of money that gets pumped into the grid can only move that fast. But it's as I said, in Uganda, we were asked, how can we stimulate demand before the grid arrives? So here we had to also, start identifying one, what is the problem? So we clearly identified that problem. The utility told us that for them, in order for a customer or for um, a site to be sustainable, they need to see demand, of at least, 16 kilowatt hours per connection. And at the time, they were only connecting new sites that was using half of that. So we had a benchmark, and that was important. The next thing was, okay, we need to identify a site. So again, we selected a site that was 1 hour from the grid. In this instance, it was 3 kilometers from the grid to be precise. And then we had to also say, oh, we have our site. We now need to, power up this community, and that is where the mini grid comes in. So we size the mini grid component, but we also, had to make it very clear for the mini grid that it's not good enough for you just to give electricity. You've got to sensitize the community. You've got to also make, over 80% of the connections within a year. That was the target. So the mini grid had 3 distinctive roles: power up the community, sensitize the community, and make over 80% of the connections. Once that was achieved, that is still not good enough. How do you get people to use power productively? I will always say this: you don't need to tell anyone on this continent how to make money out of water. I think everyone understands that you cannot grow anything without water. So people understand how to make money out of water. But electricity, you need to educate people. So we brought in productive use partners. We had a company that provided asset financing. And they also, taught people, like, training small businesses on just financial literacy and helping them to understand that if I get a fridge, how do I price my product, and how, can I also market myself that I'm now selling, cold drinks and cold beverages that can attract, more customers to my business. So it was not just giving assets and helping people, to pay for that assets, but it was also looking at, can you help them to really, grow and build their business, and how can they adopt, better business principles as they, are running their businesses. Secondly, it was also to identify, can we find, an anchor load? What does that mean? So in that specific community, there was a maize miller that was operating a diesel maize milling machine. And then there was a productive use partner that partnered with that entity, and they helped to convert, that diesel maize milling machine into an electric maize milling machine. And that became an anchor load. So it's again looking at how can we partner and how do we help the community to really unlock these opportunities to use power productively. So as these different entities were working together, we were obviously, as Power for All, we were doing the research and we were also doing the business model. We were tracking the impact. Are we seeing demand increasing? And what are those different levers that we are seeing? And the results speaks for themselves. Within just, 6 months, 90% of the community was electrified. Electricity use increased, 30-fold in 1 year in comparison to the grid connected site. We had a control site that we were just comparing our results towards. We had no safety or theft incidents. The other key thing is that the utility, had a specific role. Remember, this community was always intended to be connected to the main grid. And that meant that the smart meters, we had to use the utility smart meter. The utility had to build out the low voltage network, and the utility also had to do the vending. So that meant at the point that we connected, to the main grid and we handed the customer over to the utility, the customer didn't need to know when that happened. The customer still, could continue purchasing power the way it was explained, and that was our intention. Our intention was that we had to, align ourselves so that there was very little, if any, interruption on the customer side when interconnection happened. And I think for me, the key thing here is that there were clear roles that was, identified and defined. And we took all of these learnings and we also, looked at how does it impact the business model. And in the end, we found, that this approach, as I've already said, it increased demand, 30-fold than what, the grid can achieve. Connections, accelerated. Within 6 months, we already electrified over 90%. But then most importantly is that, those businesses who took up, asset financing, their revenues increased by 68%. And half of them, were female business owners on top of that. So you can see the importance of working together, but also being clear in terms of what is my strength? How do I leverage, my comparative advantage within this collaboration? And I think for me, that was really the innovation that we unlocked.
And that's a brilliant answer, I would say. Like you also addressed the next question I had in mind, and I'm sure so many of our listeners also had that in mind. But before we go deep into more questions that we're meant to ask, I just want to ask one very fun question. Can you share like a favorite quote or mantra that motivates you in your career? And why does it resonate so much with you?
For me, it's the old saying, unity is power. Often we want to do things by ourselves, but I think often if we partner or if we collaborate, we are stronger if we stand together. And for me, this project spoke to that. And even without my career, as much as I'm working for Power for All, I do still participate in very many other, consulting projects. And even for me, working with other teams, I often, prefer to work with people. I feel united. We are stronger. And I just want to leave that there that, unity is power and we've got to action on that. I think for me, if we as Africans can just work together with one another, we'll find that, the world is our oyster. We have yet to fully unlock, that saying of unity is power.
That quote, unity is power. What's the challenges you face in like pre-project phase in dealing with communities at first?
That is such an excellent question, and I'm glad that you've asked that. We faced very many challenges. As you would know, unfortunately, we don't have very good, quality standards. So when the community heard solar, they were totally against it because over 50% of the community had already, by virtue of some form, had access to a small little, solar panel in which they were charging, either their phones or having some lights. However, the products that was deployed, unfortunately, it was of inferior quality, and the community, they were just tired. They were like, this thing doesn't work. We don't want this thing. And it really took us, I would say, a significant amount of time. We spent, I would say, at least, 6 intensive months where we had community meeting after community meeting to just ensure that we heard the community out, but also explain to them that we are not just coming here with a mini grid. This project, was meant to place them onto the network, and that we had the utility there with us. So it was important for them to understand what was the role of the utility. We also had, someone from the ministry that was there. And we also obviously had our decentralized renewable energy partners and then obviously Power for All. But it was important for us not to go there once and to just, hear the community and then impose whatever solution we had. Time. And we really had to make sure that we had community buy-in. The community formed, part of the project. I think something that I didn't explain that I want to use this opportunity is as we were gaining the trust of the community, you must remember trust is built. So as we were doing surveys, we made the community part of the survey team. If there was another activity that we had to do in the community, we always try to figure out, okay, how can we, make the community benefit from this? So we were building trust, as we were building up to the project implementation. And I think for me that is key and that is important because at the end of the day, it's not about just, imposing solutions, impacting people's lives. That community is going to be affected. And if they are not the ones benefiting from the solution, then, what are we doing? And for me, I always look at a project. You've got to have the community. It's like for me, the community is like it's the first step. It's core. If you don't get community buy-in, if you don't make that community part and part of your implementation plan, you are in for a very difficult process or even just operating that site.
So looking at what you have implemented in this community right now and post-project phase now, how do you see this project being implemented in other areas in Uganda that still awaiting connection to electricity?
Yeah. So first thing I also just want to say is that the project didn't just stop at showing that this model has got benefits for the utility and for the DRE partners. We obviously also had to look at the policy. And this project was also the first project that tested, because at the time Uganda was still developing what is called its isolated electricity grid regulations. And this is, what allows for interconnection with, renewable energy systems. And we were also the first project that tested that regulation. So not only did we shape that regulation, but we also tested the process, and it helped the regulator to identify certain areas that still needs to be refined within, that newly developed regulations. And over and above that, at the time, Uganda was also revising its energy policy. And again, we had the opportunity to impact that policy where the ministry adopted an integrated energy framework. Now, I'm mentioning policy because without this, you can't see adoption or replication, not just in Uganda, but within other markets. So it was important for us to look at what is the enabling environment in order for, such an approach to be executed at mass. So these two policies are important, but I think there are some other key learnings that we took from this project, and we do recognize that this was only, one site, but I think it opens up, insights into what are the different, market applications that can be used, to test this model. For example, as I said, in Uganda, we call this an early grid development model. Again, if there's an area and that area at the point of interconnection, your network reliability is weak, you could find that in our application, we decided to decommission the solar mini grid generation assets at interconnection. But you could find that if the grid has got, a weak grid network, those assets can remain interconnected, and it can help with the reliability of the network. So that is another application that can be tested. Then there is another market application, what we are calling a weak grid, and a country that has got limited generation, supply capacity. So think of Nigeria, think of South Africa, think of Zambia, Malawi. These are all countries, that are struggling with, they don't have enough, power in the country. And at the same time, the utilities are struggling. And if we think about it, there's an opportunity again for your decentralized renewable energy companies, such as your mini grids, to come in and to strengthen, the network. So they can come in, as I said, power up a community. So be interconnected with the grid, but also increase the solar generation side of things so that they can increase, the generation supply capacity in the country. So that's another example or, method of, this model being tested. And then there's a third market application that is you have countries, they've invested a lot in, their network. So they have got, what is called high connectivity rates. And then at the same time, they have got very low consumption. So think of countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania. They've invested a lot of money into, the grid being extended. They've got a relatively stable generation in the country, but they are finding that not everyone wants to be connected or people are not using power productively. So again, there, the focus would be to do demand stimulation. So it's working with the utilities and your productive use of energy companies, and it's really helping the customers and those communities to just use power productively. So I would say that for me is some of the learnings and some of the market opportunities that we see with this model. And already we know that this weak grid model has been tested in Nigeria. So it's already showing that this model is replicatable in other, market contexts.
That's nice, like to see like the comparison and the similarities with what is happening currently now with Uganda is also in a very similar way happening in different continents based on their market application and based on their electricity assets and the tools needed to solve the solution and tools needed to to provide the solution they need in yielding or shielding that gap. So this brings me to the very last technical questions about why we are all here. The listeners are also asking about what is the afterlife of each project? like in terms of sustainability, in terms of community use, long-term benefits? What is the afterlife of all these models after the project have been implemented?
So, I mean, obviously, as I've already said, these communities, they will have, sustainable access to power. It unlocks, economic benefits for the communities. Because previously, if you can just imagine, you couldn't, run certain activities because there wasn't reliable power. But now, because there's reliable power, there are other economic, activities that can now, be done. But over and above that, I think it's also, as I said, to look at the broader, energy system. What does this mean for the utility? So all of a sudden, the utility now has got, customers that is using power productively. They can, continue to, maintain and sustain that network. So we can see, a higher, network reliability because there's improved, maintenance and investment into the network. But most importantly, we are also opening up the mini grid market. For example, we done some modeling, and in Uganda alone, initially it was said that the mini grid market, can only service 100,000, customers. But with this, model, all of a sudden the mini grids can, tap into 1.5 million connections. So that just means for the country alone, it shows that the mini grid market is investable and it could attract further investment. So I think for me, it's to look at not just at the community level, but what does this mean for the country? What does this mean, in terms of attracting investment? But at the end of the day, we need to educate people about these models. It's all good and well that, we've shown that this works, but if people don't know about this, then we are not going to see, more adoption. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done around, advocacy. And then at the same time, as I said, the policymakers, they've got some work to do. So policymakers and utilities must work together to create that enabling environment. And they've got to be willing, to collaborate with other players in the market for us, to see a higher adoption, of this model.
That's brilliant to hear, like what's the whole afterlife and what's the importance of collaboration in ensuring that we reach our target, like each country reach our target in terms of electrification percentage at a certain period of time. So to wrap up this conversation and question, what skill is someone required to have in order to be a country director for Power for All? What skill is required to reach such potential?
That's actually a difficult question, but let me try. I think I'm gonna come back to one. You've got to be optimistic. You've got to, as I said, how do you work with other people? And for us here at Power for All, we are very, reliant on collaborations. We as an organization, we cannot, function or operate if we are not, collaborating and partnering. So you've got to be willing to work with others and also be willing to learn from others. I think for me, those are, the key skills is just be willing to learn, be open to collaborate, and work with others.
Thank you so much. So everyone here that be willing to collaborate and work with others. So now just to wrap up with our fun question is, can you just describe a moment in your career when you felt like giving up because it was so overwhelming, but you persevered? And how did it shape your resilience professionally?
Thank you so much for that question. So I've given hints that I'm originally from South Africa. So when I decided to transition out of the South African energy market almost a decade ago now, it wasn't easy. I mean, I had no plan, but I decided, let me come to Uganda. I didn't come, with the intention of staying here, but I was like, I need to learn, I need to understand this market, and I just wanted to, gain experience. So it was my curiosity that forced me to learn a little bit more about the market. And I wrote one article on LinkedIn about energy efficiency in Uganda. And let's just say that so many of my friends who were doing projects out here reached out, and also Power for All reached out based on that LinkedIn article. And that kind of opened up the doors. As you can imagine, moving from one country to a new country, I didn't know anyone in the energy sector space. I had no intention of even, working, in a new country or a new market. That was, not my intent. And it was very difficult. It was also very difficult, to pick up the threads and to develop your networks in a new country. But I believe with today's, tools, and also in terms of having access through social media, one should leverage those tools, because it's, as I said, I wrote one article and that opened up, so many opportunities for myself. And almost a decade later, I'm still out here.
But thank you so much for joining us today, Sumaya. So thank you once again for joining us on this journey through the lives of incredible African leaders in the sustainable energy industry. And if you enjoyed this series, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave a review. Remember, your voice matters too. Stay tuned for more at the Energy Africa Cafe, shaping Africa's energy future. Thank you.